Mayo Educación Ejecutiva, de la mano de Toledo Marchetti Advogados, CONEXIG y Legal Delta, les da la más cordial bienvenida al webinar Oportunidades para la implementación de contratos de alianza en proyectos de construcción en América Latina, una aproximación práctica de lo que ha funcionado y lo que no, el cual es transmitido a través de Zoom. Mientras esperamos a los demás participantes, les recordamos que el día 27 de octubre estamos iniciando el curso de especialización Contratos y Entornos Colaborativos en Latinoamérica, donde en tan solo 18 horas de clase estarás capacitado para analizar los principales aspectos técnicos y legales de los procesos colaborativos, tomando como referencia su desarrollo presente en los contratos FIDIC, NEC y AFC One. Ahora sí, vamos a dar inicio al webinar. Les comentamos que la exposición del abogado será en inglés. En este webinar también nos acompañará el ingeniero Mateo Sánchez Rodríguez, a quien le cederé la palabra en este momento.
Hola, buenos días o buenas tardes a todos. Mi nombre es Mateo Rodríguez Sánchez, soy ingeniero industrial. Estoy ubicado en España, soy español y ahora mismo me encuentro en Madrid. Mi experiencia y mi currículo han sido casi 50 años de profesión, de los cuales durante 40 años he estado involucrado en la ejecución de proyectos llave en mano internacionales con la empresa Dragados. Durante esa etapa hemos realizado proyectos EPC en medio mundo, en el Middle East, en Latinoamérica, Perú, Argentina, Ecuador y en Europa. Principalmente mi experiencia está centrada en proyectos de oil and gas, tanto en la dirección upstream como dirección downstream y por supuesto todos los derivados de química y petroquímica de dichos productos. Los últimos 10 años me he dedicado al tema de asesoramiento de empresas y arbitrajes y temas de disputas, apoyando a empresas españolas e internacionales, bien sea en reclamaciones o bien sea en peritajes. Voy a presentar a los participantes que van a llevar el curso y la charla esta. Por un lado tenemos a Franco, abogado, árbitro y profesor. Ha trabajado en proyectos y controversias de ingeniería y construcción en América Latina, Europa y Asia, tanto como abogado interno de empresas propietarias como de contratistas internacionales. Asimismo, también ha participado como abogado externo y árbitro. Actualmente lidera el equipo de trabajo a cargo de traducir al español y adaptar el contrato de alianza FAC 1. Leonardo Toledo da Silva es abogado y árbitro. Está especializado en el área de infraestructura y construcción, con amplia experiencia en proyectos, arbitraje y otros métodos alternativos de resolución de disputas. Leonardo es el actual presidente del Instituto Brasileño del Derecho de la Construcción, IBDIC, y es profesor de Derecho de la Construcción en la Fundación Getúlio Vargas. Asimismo, ha publicado libros y artículos sobre materias relacionadas con infraestructura, derecho de la construcción y derecho corporativo. Leonardo tiene una maestría y un doctorado en Derecho por la Universidad de Sao Paulo. Felipe Gutiérrez cuenta con 20 años de experiencia en la prestación de servicios, en la prevención y mitigación de riesgos y en la resolución de disputas. Posee un magíster en Derecho de la Construcción y Arbitraje, un posgrado en Derecho de la Construcción e Infraestructura, una licenciatura en Contabilidad, una maestría en Economía. Felipe es certificado en Auditoría en Obra, en Gestión de Proyectos por el PMP, en Ingeniería de Costo, en Auditoría Interna, en Aseguración de Riesgos y en Charter de Surveyor. Ha apoyado a clientes en la construcción e ingeniería en Australia, África, Europa y en América. Expone regularmente internacionalmente en temas centrados en la infraestructura, ingeniería, construcción y comunidades legales. Y ahora le cedo la palabra a Franco.
Buenos días con todos. Es un gusto tener como expositor el día de hoy a Leonardo Toledo y compartir el panel con Felipe Gutiérrez y Mateo Sánchez. En los últimos años se ha venido empleando el término contratos colaborativos, pero se observa que no todos entendemos lo mismo al usar ese concepto. Por ejemplo, se suele decir que un contrato NEC o FIDIC es un contrato colaborativo. Sabemos que hay un rango de intensidad de colaboración. En una escala del 1 al 10, el FIDIC se podría ubicar quizás en el 1, y el contrato NEC, si se emplea sin las opciones, quizás en un 3. Mientras que en la parte alta de la escala tenemos el esquema Integrated Trade Delivery y los contratos de alianza. Considero muy valioso tener un espacio como este webinar para comentar sobre un esquema que está en la parte alta de la escala, pues nos dará una mejor idea de qué es lo que se considera realmente colaborativo en el ámbito internacional. En América Latina ha habido pocas experiencias de contratos de alianza y Brasil es el país que más ha aprobado el esquema. En ese contexto, Leonardo Toledo ha jugado y sigue jugando un rol central como asesor de empresas y como profesor. En el ámbito regional, es quizás quien más ha estudiado el tema, tiene una tesis de doctorado al respecto y ha analizado en la práctica la experiencia australiana e internacional. Leonardo ha promovido excelentes webinars sobre el tema desde el Instituto Brasilero de Derecho de la Construcción este año, pero no ha habido muchas oportunidades para escuchar su visión personal del tema, así que este webinar nos brinda esa oportunidad. Sin más introducción, le paso la palabra a Felipe Gutiérrez.
Muchas gracias a todos, muchas gracias a los participantes también. Y bueno, con muchísimo gusto e interés estaremos hablando de este tema que, como comentó Eric, es bastante interesante, por un lado. Hay visiones distintas, como vamos a estar observando en este webinar. Hay cosas que son positivas, otras más no tanto. Hay maneras de implementar lo que muestra en la experiencia práctica que sí puede funcionar. Y de eso voy quizás a tocar un poquito más en algún momento, lo que he vivido en Australia en 4 años que viví allá. Aunque sea una experiencia de 10 años atrás, sigo actualizado, sé que siguen utilizando mucho y sigue funcionando. O sea, es un tipo de contratación que sí se puede utilizar. Entonces, sin más, paso la palabra a Leonardo, que tiene una presentación que está bastante interesante, seguro lo van a disfrutar mucho y con bastante ansiedad para empezar a intercambiar también ideas y escuchar las opiniones y preguntas del público. Leonardo, por favor.
Thank you very much, Eric. Thank you, Felipe. Thank you, Mateo, for the introduction. It's certainly an honor for me to be speaking here for everyone. And also, I would like to thank Mayo Education for the invitation, for putting up all this event. I have to apologize to my colleagues of Spanish language that I'm not able to speak Spanish as good as I would like to. I do understand everything as every Brazilian thinks they understand. Sometimes they might be mistaken. As I was mentioning to my colleagues, my New Year's resolution is always to improve my Spanish. This year, I might get it. Well, with no further delay, I would say that this is the topic that I've been speaking for at least 10 years in Brazil and saying and kind of preaching, because there's lots of interesting information that, even though are obvious, has some difficult to sink in, to be absorbed by the practice. So I'm going to share with you one PPT presentation. Hopefully it's not too boring. Let me share here, 1 second. Can you confirm with me if it's, you guys can see it?
Sí, se ve bien.
That's great. So we are going to talk about the opportunities here and what are the lessons learned from Brazil that we can share with everyone? What are some practical insights that we can bring to everyone here? I like to start any presentation, or most of my presentations online, in telling an important story for people to understand what collaboration means. Because people understand sometimes that collaboration is giving hands, making friends, and being nice to each other. I think this is a very poor understanding of what can be practices related to collaboration. This is something more related to technique, to technology. So Everybody's familiar with the idea of the Wikipedia. Wikipedia was a phenomenon. You can argue if there are some problems here and there, but for those who are a little bit older, you will remember something like Encarta. Encarta was an encyclopedia launched by Microsoft, a very strong group with a lot of money involved and they were supposed to be the next thing after Britannica and all those encyclopedias that we had like decades ago. But when Wikipedia came, it was in January 2001, it came with an idea of people working together, connected in a network without being compensated. At that point, if you ask any economics specialist or even a consultant, they would probably say that it would fail, because the idea is that someone will only contribute to a project to the extent that they have two incentives, either an economic incentive or hierarchy. They are in an institution that if they don't abide they don't work with the orders that they receive, they probably will have some penalty. And so Wikipedia, when it was launched to be a support to bring material to another encyclopedia called Nupedia. Their project was to launch Nupedia. And Wikipedia was only an experiment, and it was not something that they bet at that time that would work. Well, in 2014, when I was getting some data here, Wikipedia had like 33 million definitions in its website in at least 287 languages, different languages. So it became a monster in a way that Encarta had to be discontinued, and sometimes the fail of Encarta is of course related to the success of Wikipedia. And why I'm saying that to you, what does that relate to Alliance? I want to start to bring in you the power and the idea that some tools that connect people in networks that do not respond exactly to hierarchy and some principles, they're starting to be used in different ways of institution. There's a book called Penguin and the Leviathan by Yochai Benkler, for example, that mention many of the situations and many of the cases, such as the police of Chicago, in which they use the network of the people to connect and to find results, even the Toyota way of production. But the fact is, organizations are from time to time getting some improvement on their people organization based on ideas such as communication, working in nets, and not usually connected to only hierarchy. And that happened also in the construction industry. If you look at the first documented case of Alliance, it's a very famous case in the North Sea. It's called, it was a project called Andrew Field Oil. It was a field that belonged to BP, British Petroleum, and BP had a very challenging project there because they had tried to approve the budget of the project a couple of times before, and they were never able to approve because the cost for implementation was too high at that point. There was too much risk, and all the model of implementation of the projects would bring too much risk. So at that point, BP understood that they would only be able to make this a viable project if they found a way to reduce costs and found a way to improve efficiency. So they tried to see what worked best for them, where were the inefficiencies of their organization. One thing that they did different is that they called the main suppliers at that point to participate since the beginning of the project. Even though in a regular project, you would first develop the engineering, the design, and then start including the contractors as it becomes more or less relevant in the project. They tried to gather a group. The most important people would have to be part even in the beginning of the project. And they found out and they looked for a way to make a collective incentive at that point. If the group would succeed, they would succeed together. If they would fail together. But the point is, they realized that there was lots of people sometimes working the same function in the project. So there is a guy from quality from the contractor, and a guy of quality from the owner, a guy of for example environment quality, environment, and healthy, things like that. They realized that they could reduce the capex of the project if they found a way to create common incentives. And they did that. They called the ones that they trusted the most. They trusted the most for bringing this first project. So in this project was so interesting that they had first budget of 450 million pounds, and in the end of the day they delivered the project with a budget of 290 million pounds. If there is a book only for this project that is very interesting, that when they finished the first stage of budgeting, and so they found a target price for the project, they had something like 350 million. The number was so unbelievable, even the 350 million, that one of the minority shareholders of Andrew Field, they wanted to sell their minority share for BP because they didn't believe that 350 was feasible, was achievable. In the end of the day, they made a number of 290 million pounds. You, of course, can imagine the kind of noise that it made for the market and impact, especially for, as my researcher points, I would say that Australia and New Zealand are probably some of the most developed countries that used this idea and improved it and created a lot of benchmarking related to that. But, well, what is this thing? What is this beast? Let's align a little bit of concept here. What is a contract alliance? Eric was saying something that was very important, that maybe there is not one thing called alliance. That's for sure. That's one of the most difficult things of my thesis, that I had to read a lot of paper and everybody saying, oh, this is an alliance. It was one thing. And then if you look, for example, in the Australian benchmark, alliancing is quite different. The project alliance is quite different that I see, for example, in UK or US, which don't use alliance as much as at least to my understanding. Well, so even in Brazil, I start to stop only talking about alliancing and start to talk about what are the collaborative features that this specific benchmarking bring to the table. One thing it's important to understand is like the basic idea behind alliance. What's the basic idea behind alliance? To understand this basic idea, it's important that you understand a regular project. Of course, I'm going to be anecdotal here a little bit. Let's say use strong colors, but of course, it's just to show some problems of the regular and traditional way of organizing projects. If you look at IPC turnkey project, for example, it's quite common that people have what we call high informational asymmetry. If you look at if it happens one problem, sometimes in the middle of a project, or even in the beginning of the project, it's quite likely that the owner has a lot of information related, for example, to stakeholders, financing, and the local, sometimes usually better than the contractors. And the contractors, by its turn, they have a lot more information related to the technical aspects, design, and things that, for example, value engineering, they don't want to share. They have an incentive because the project are organized in a way that people are putting not in a common goal situation. So they don't, if the owner doesn't have the incentive to share this information too much, because if they do share, for example, that would be have a price consequence. And in the same way, sometimes the contractors don't have the incentive to share all their value and all their things that they could share. They wait to use this strategically. It's quite expecting in this kind of project. It looks crazy if I tell my 6-year daughter, who actually made birthday today, that in a project involving billions of dollars, people don't trust each other regularly. She wouldn't believe it to say this makes no sense, because it's totally something that against the common sense that people are trying to put a very hard work together and they don't trust each other. But the fact is, this kind of information brings a very little degree of trust between counterparties. Of course, there are ways of fighting this kind of balance or dangerous balance. Risk allocation is also a problem. If you look at risk allocation, usually there's this idea that you will allocate the risk to the one who is most suitable to mitigate or to manage that risk. This is, of course, is a principle for project management, but does it happen all times or often in projects, or risk allocation also has to do with what's your power of negotiation at the time of the contract? And another thing, are you sure if you get a too complex project, who is the best part to mitigate? And something else, do you think that maybe the two parties together will need to work together to, if you think, for example, for COVID-19, to deal with the risks that they do not foresee? Okay, so it's quite usual that projects have what I call poor risk allocation. There's one thing that also is very connected to regular or traditional projects. They have some difficulty to deal with variations. I usually ask people, what is the one thing that do not change in a project that is complex? The one thing is the fact that something will change. But if you look at the EPC contract or a FIDIC contract, usually you'll see that this is designed in a way to treat variation as an exogenous thing, something that is very exceptional, even though we know it's not exceptional. So why do we treat this as an anomaly when you have to understand that this is the rule of the business? It happens. The thing is, how do you deal with the variation? All these things end up in one thing that I call a dangerous balance, a very dangerous balance, because everything that goes a little wrong tend people to go to what I call not collaborative balance. People try to, each one in its side, fight for their rights and fight for their position. So the basic idea behind the whole technology of alliancing is, let's disarm this bomb, let's capture some of this inefficiency, because if you are familiar with the project, I can say that if I participate in 10 project alliances, I'll probably participate in 90 EPC contracts at least. I would say for sure that what I'm saying here is not a exaggeration. It happens. And the idea of alliances, let's work to try to disarm this bomb of collaborative behavior and try to capture these inefficiencies and create some improvement specifically based on the idea that some decisions can be made collectively, and this has an important power as we see in, for example, Wikipedia that we mentioned before. So besides the basic idea, let's go to some more practical and more detailed insights. First thing that I think that it's important to understand, the idea of risk sharing does not have to be like that. If you look, for example, at FACE1, it doesn't have a risk allocation of sharing risk allocation as a rule. But if you look, for example, the benchmarking for project alliance in Australia, they do recommend risk allocation to be shared whenever you have a risk that you do not understand or something that is likely to be better treated by both parties. This is a good way of thinking. So do you remember of the idea of disarming the bomb? If you look at APC contract, they work in a logical of win-lose or lose-win condition. If I deliver to you as a contractor something that should cost more and I couldn't rebalance my price, you are winning, I'm losing. In the other position, and vice versa. If I deliver to you something that's less quality in the same price, I'm winning and you are losing. So there is this alignment of interest, this clear alignment of interest that sometimes creates problem to that balance that I mentioned before. So the whole idea of behavioral balance is treated here. So the idea of risk sharing is to move from a win-lose situation to a win-win situation or a lose-lose situation. Another feature that is very important and misunderstood here in Brazil, at least until recently, because now I see some movements on this direction, is to understand that integration of players, especially integration of engineering using technologies such as BIM, has a strong impact on correcting mistakes that you find during the design stage of the project. If you bring different perspectives to one problem, in any situation, in my law firm, we do that all the time. If you bring different perspectives to one problem, they will be enriched by each one's view of the problem. It has a lot of challenge to do that, but it's very powerful aspect or feature on alliancing. One other thing that it relates to building trust. If you look, for example, to this benchmark of alliancing in Australia, they usually build an integrated governance very similar to a corporate. They have the alliance leadership team, which is sort of a board of director, and the alliance management team would be like the officers, and the project team, which is the people that deliver the project. They have to work together in integrated way, in a way that they make communication become something inherent to the project. There's other things that they mention. One is an unanimous decision, which is more, is something I would say more sensitive, because some people believe that if you have an unanimous decision, you can have what we call lock-up situation or a deadlock situation. And in my empirical survey in Australia, this idea of unanimous decision didn't show as a, let's say, something that could cause a lot of deadlock situations. This is one thing that we can discuss again later, because it's one very tricky question. And also they have to take decisions best for project. So the idea of creating one group here that work in the interest of the project, and they have to align this interest of the project in the beginning. Of course, each one belongs to one different organization. But I've been to Australia, for example. Felipe might confirm it or not. I talked to people from alliances there. They had their own website, their own badge. They would work together. They would have lunch together during the project. It starts to create the whole idea of one interest which is aligned with this group, not necessarily and totally with your organization. But of course, there might be some tension there. Open book and open communication. Again, we are trying to disarm the bomb. We cannot work with information that we cannot share, because if you do that, the idea of a mutual distrust will come likely. And then people will say, there's this question that I take all the time is, well, but if I have, for example, information such as cost structure or things that are very important to competition, and I don't want to release to the market, I would say that in this situation that you can back up why you have some points that you don't want to show or to be open about. You have to be very clear why that is happening, and this is understandable. But of course, you have to be clear. There is no way around without being very honest and transparent here. In open communication, the whole idea of interrogation already brings the idea of open communication, but you have to incentive people to bring to the table as much problem as they have. As much problem as they have, without thinking of a hierarchy or without thinking of who is exactly responsible for that thing. You have to be open to communication, which leads to the no blame, no dispute culture. Of course, again, this is not in every contract alliance. This is some possible feature. I want to make it sure, because if you look at FA1, for example, you will not find this. But it's very interesting, especially in legal terms, because the idea behind this, you cannot pursue or you cannot sue one of the key players of the project only based on their failure, unless their failure you can say that was gross negligence or intentional misconduct. This is also an interesting story, because if you look at the beginning of alliance here, when I was talking to some people in Australia, the idea of no dispute was something like, no, they cannot dispute, they cannot go to court. Of course, this is not legal. So with time, they were developing better this concept. So there's two aspects of the idea of no blame, no dispute. The first one is, if you are going to blame someone, you need to have something like a willful misconduct, as I said. And the no dispute is try to keep within the project as much as you can the decision that has to be made in the project. One thing that is worth mentioning is that if you look at guidelines for contract alliance in Australia, they would recommend even not to have dispute resolution clauses. I know this is very polemical. And I even wouldn't recommend that in Brazil, for example, but when I did an empirical survey there was one message that I understood from, especially from project owners, not from lawyers as myself, but they would say, if you bring in a very clear path for escalation of the decision, be sure that most likely this decision will be escalated. It's a good, interesting point. I'm not quite sure of what to believe here, but I like to listen. Well, some practical insights. First, it's quite usual that you have two stages of implementing one project alliance. The first one is setting up. And the second one is implementing the works. In the setting up stages, you have to bring people, all the alliance members. In this, there's a big difference between a regular approach to delivering a project, that you already bring some of the contractors that you believe have a lot of impact in this, even though they will work hardly on the second stage. You already bring these guys to give opinion on the project. So the integration of engineering, it is something that we call early case involvement of the contractors. In a regular project, you would sometimes or a EPC contract, which is different. You give the whole problem to someone else. But in a regular contract for a DBB approach, design, bid, build, you would contract the design from someone who is specialist in this kind of design, and then you would give to another people to implement the project. This causes a lot of tensions in the project, and one of the differences here is that you bring people to the first stage, even though they will be more relevant in the second stage. And the work in the stage one, which is very important, I'm going to talk about a little bit later when I talk about lessons learned here in Brazil, is quite like setting up a special purpose company. You have to think in this way, because you start to make alignments, goals alignment, align KPIs, relevant procedures. If you look, for example, the standard form that the government of Australia released, it's very interesting to see what all the charts and all the procedures they ask people to produce in this first stage. It's very much like setting up a new special purpose company. But in this stage one, they will probably have to deliver the budgeting and time for completion expected for this project. Of course, this is the most relevant KPI usually. And in this, the end of the stage one, which is again designing, planning, you will give the owner the chance to withdraw from the project. They will have the chance to a go or no go decision. So if they don't go ahead with the budget that they have, and this is a decision that has to be taken solely by governance outside of the alliance, because the governance that is related specifically to the owner, the second stage doesn't happen. So the second stage seems to be the simpler one, even though it's the most capital intensive one. The fact is, if you did a good work in the stage one, you'll probably have a good chance of have a stage two very well with less problem than you can imagine. Eric, when we were discussing, he said, Leonardo, you could give us some hints about the fees arrangement for NOPs, because it brings people some confusion. I'll try, it's a little bit confusion, but I'll try to do my best here. If you look, for example, in the model that we practice here in Brazil and was very much influenced by the model of the Australian benchmarking, I would say that we have three components of fees in the fees arrangement for the NOPs. Which is NOPs, just for you to understand? No owner participant, all the players that are no owner. So when you were in stage one here, you were setting up a target cost. One thing that they were saying, target outturn cost. In this target cost, you can include, for example, costs even from the owner, of risks of the owner that will be shared collectively, or I would say risks that usually are the owner, could be for the alliance in this case. Each part will have its own costs there. So the first component is cost reimbursement. Of course, the owner doesn't reimburse himself, but he has to reimburse the cost of all the other NOPs, no owner participants. This is one thing that has to be auditable, because what is costs, we know that can be very tricky sometimes, can be very polemical or has some doubts on it. And there are a second component of profit overhead, which is a fixed or a percentage fee, either in the target cost or in the real cost. Is something that has to be agreed and arranged. And there's this component 3, which is the gain share, pain share mechanisms. Do you remember that we said that we need a target cost and a target time for completion of the project? The idea is that this cost will be very much related to the risks that are shared for the alliance members. In the end of the project, if you fail to achieve these KPIs, not only the KPI of cost and target, but this one's the easy one to understand. If you are thinking that you spend like $100 million in one project, and then you ended up consuming 110 million, the idea is that this 10 million will be shared between the members. Of course, there might be some discussions on cap risk or putting the risks to a limit. But also, if you reduce the same 100 budget to 90 million, the idea is that this 10 million of savings will be shared also by the members of the alliance group. And then you say, how is it going to be shared? It's 50-50 between owner and non-owner. This is something that has to be discussed in the first stage, in the beginning of the project. For example, if you think of Andrew Field, which was the first, I believe that the owner would bear like 54% of the costs, if I'm not mistaken by memory, and the non-owners were like the remaining. But that's the idea. Well, Eric, later you can ask me if it was enough clear, but I'm going ahead of time here, so I have to go on. There's applicability chart. One thing that I like to mention to you is that alliance is not for every project. There is a spectrum of complexity in the project. The more complex the project is, the more you need to involve people in the beginning, the more you are uncertain about risks, the more suitable be for a project alliance. The idea is the more you have inefficiencies in a traditional project, because traditional projects are not suited to deal with very complex situations or uncertain situations, the more you'll be suited for a project alliance. Because it tries to capture these inefficiencies. Well, let's talk about Brazil. This is something else. If you ask Brazilian people, generally, Felipe can back it up, what is our experience with alliance? Most people say it didn't work. I would say that this is a very simplistic answer, because I participated in some of the projects. Some were, let's say, successful. Some had some struggle. But one thing I can say that even though this project that had struggle, I couldn't say for sure that if we had, for example, an APC arrangement, the struggle wouldn't be there anyway. So it's kind of tricky question. And the answer has to be a little subjective. I'm gonna try to bring some obvious lesson learned, because I'm a lawyer. I can only say obvious things about project management. I cannot say things that are too complex, even though even a lawyer can understand that something we're not doing correctly. Well, first, one lesson learned I would like to mention is probably a major idea that connects to all the other lessons. Contract alliance is not limited to the economic incentive model. I remember, for example, when I was dealing with a very senior project manager in one company, and they said, oh, I do alliancing for a long time. I have EPCM contracts here with penalties and let's say in bonus that brings the same solution. because in the mind of many of people that I conversed and I talked, they would think that alliance has to do exactly with that price mechanism. But the whole idea of integration, working in nets, were not there. And if you have this mindset thinking that only people will collaborate because they have a contract saying that they have a gain share and paying share mechanism, it's not enough. It's not enough. And this is one of the first mistakes that I would see often in the projects that I were involved. In the project that I wasn't involved, but people would always wanted to talk to me because I was very curious about. And it was clear that some of them were mixing up, thinking that alliance is basically its price model. It's not. Second thing that is worth mentioning is be careful with the reasons for choosing the model. What I could see is that some of the owner, for example, that I worked for, were thinking very poorly in the reasons that were driving them to use the alliances and the effort that they would have to make. It, again, is connected to the first point, because they thought, okay, if I signed this contract, so I'm gonna pay less, that's the deal, I'm in. So alliancing has a very strong intuitive idea that people will work better and reduce costs working collaboratively. But it's very hard to put together one change in mindset like that. So one thing that is clear to me is that people were not enough informed about this, the effort that they would have to put in a project to make it work. For example, I had a meeting last week and people said, Leonardo, can you put up an alliance for us? And I said, what is your degree of engagement with this decision? Because I have to tell you, I've seen this in different projects. It's all about how much you're going to take seriously this decision, because it's an easy decision in a certain way, because I believe it's so obvious that you're going to reduce costs that you don't understand. You have to choose and find different ways to work with people. Number 3, be careful with adversarial behavior. What I saw in the projects, if you took it, for example, a very old-fashioned owner that is used to, for example, always think that the contractor is trying to bypass them, or the contractor who has sometimes the bad manner of not sharing information that they have. This kind of behavior, it's very much automatic. It's something that you are already used to do it. So it's quite easy to see people going back to business as usual, the adversarial behavior, and pointing fingers to say, oh no, this is something that he should have done, or not me, this is not my problem. This kind of behavior is very, and I saw that happen. For example, once I was engaged by one contractor company saying, Leonardo, can you give us advice and can you help us to implement a very good claim management condition in this project alliance in here? And I said, oh man, what is this project alliance? Why is that? And then I understood that it was only a project alliance in the paper, because people were still working in silos and different, not integrated, and thinking that each one is responsible for only its own problem. There's a risk that we understood happened in Brazil. One thing that is important is the drive for adopting the model must come preferably by the owner. In some project that I've been, there was one important contractor in Brazil trying to sell the idea to many project owners. And some of them, in the end of the day, ended up going, let's say, going on with the project, with the project alliance. But it looks to us that there was always a seed of distrust, something that, oh, is this guy showing me this project because probably it's better for him? So it's important, and I've heard this also from some consultants in Australia saying that, and it made sense when I realized that what happened in Brazil. It's important that the project owner is a driver of the adoption of the model. Number 5, and this is key. There is a work very nice made even with empirical data, showing that there's some very important success aspects of the project. And one of them is, quality of and engagement of leadership. Putting up an environment of collaboration has a lot to do with the quality of leadership. The leadership that is able to work very well in a project with collaboration is very different of leadership that goes with a lot of hierarchy. The leadership of collaboration is a mediator, someone that is quite understand the process and understand which people, which companies, which players can contribute to each decision. So he has to be very active and listen a lot and try to coordinate all these people together. He has to lead, but not lead in a way of giving the decisions, making people follow, but lead in a way that creates consistency. I would say that it's the victory of consistency over hierarchy. People has to bring the best solution to the table. The leader is the key factor for that. It has studies that show that. It's not something that I'm saying. And in Brazil, it's clear. I was, for example, negotiating some of the agreements. I'll say, my God, this guy is going to be the project manager. He was in a very, I say so position. So you have to go for it. And when you have this kind of behavior, you create a rolling ball of non-collaboration, and you end up in that balance that we say. One thing that is also important is do not underestimate the first stage, setting up. Of course, there is a bad incentive of setting up because you still don't have go-on decisions in the first stage. You don't know if you're going on with the project, so you don't want to spend as much time. But the less you spend in the first stage, the more likely you have problems the second one. Especially in the things like alignment of goals and procedures. You have to think that if people will have to work together for a couple of years, 3 years or so, in a project-intensive project like we are used to, at least 2-3 years, and they have to be very much aligned. And also integration of engineering. This is very much still misused in our reality, for as obvious as it is. So if you want to be more certain that you have a very good project, you have to be more attentive to the first stage, setting up the project. Last information, because I think my time is up, is related to the role of the legal team. The role of the legal team. The legal team has to have the mindset set as all the other team, but the legal is usually trained not to think in the best of the project, but to think in the best of their client. There's a very funny story that I want to share with you, that I was once participating in one of the project alliance, and one of the legal counsels, internal legal counsel of one of the teams called me and said, Leonardo, I'm a little worried about this project because, you know, I received the first draft of the contract alliance from the owner, it seems to me that I'm not sure if the other lawyer knows what he's doing, but I ended up putting a lot of risk back to the owner. Risks that usually would go to be shared in the alliance, I put back to the owner, and they accepted. So now I'm a little bit worried that it might undermine the whole project because it's too good to me. It's a paradox. It's an interesting paradox, because if you work too much in the interest of your client, in this case, you might be ending up creating an unbalance or not best for the project structure. Well, this is some of the insights I'd like to share with you. Hopefully I didn't take too much time. I'm very enthusiastic and passionate about it because I believe there is a wave coming, and when this wave comes, everybody has to surf it. Thanks a lot, Eric and Felipe. The floor is yours, and I'll be more than happy to share this presentation after with the people that are participating in this webinar.
Vale, muchas gracias, Leonardo. Creo que es fantástico la presentación y la experiencia. Muchas gracias por compartir. Y ha estado muy interesante, ¿no? Yo, por suerte, vamos a tener un curso del tema que empieza al final del mes, donde vamos a poder explorar más de estos temas, que de hecho son temas que podríamos estar hablando por días. Cada uno de los puntos que mencionas, ¿no? Pero al menos para mí como consultor técnico, no soy abogado, pero me interesa mucho discutir más, entender más y aprofundar más, poder compartir y entender por qué en ciertas partes funciona y en otras partes hay más dificultad. Y con ello, la pregunta que me gustaría hacer, Leonardo, es una pregunta de un tema que a mí me apasiona mucho, entre otras razones porque personalmente tengo un perfil desde nacimiento muy multicultural, digamos, y profesionalmente finalmente fue lo que pasó también conmigo. He vivido en muchas partes. Me interesa mucho entender tu perspectiva desde el punto cultural. O sea, se habla mucho de experiencias de suceso en el mundo quizás más anglosajón, ¿no? En Australia, Nueva Zelanda, en Inglaterra, con algunas adaptaciones en Estados Unidos. Y en Latinoamérica todavía, quizás la pregunta para ti es más Brasil, ¿no? Pero en Latinoamérica yo veo, aunque seamos todos muy distintos los países, hay muchísima semejanza, ¿no? Entre los latinos. Entonces, si pudieras, me gustaría entender quizás un poquito el tema de la cultura, cómo impacta, ¿no? Si los países como Brasil, si el aspecto cultural pesa mucho. Y quizás se pudiera tocar un poco en el tema que en mi visión uno de los temas que viene con la cultura es el tema del planning. O sea, tenemos una voluntad quizás de ya empezar las cosas y no invertir tanto en la fase 1, ¿no? En stage 1 que estaban presentando. Y eso creo que por muchas veces es uno de los puntos de dificultad en la implementación de este tipo de contrato en Brasil y en otras partes de Latinoamérica. Pero me gustaría escuchar tu opinión, por favor.
No, gracias, Felipe. Es muy interesante. I'm going to talk in English again. Let's switch. Well, the question about culture is something that we always get. And let me stop sharing here the presentation so that I can see you all. And of course, I can agree that there is a cultural component in the behavior of people. Of course there is. And people always ask me, oh, Leonardo, do you think we have culture for that? I don't think so. It's maybe an Anglo-Saxon thing. But when you look at projects and you see that people didn't even make the simple tasks of project management you're going to say, I cannot even answer that for sure because people didn't use the tool as much or as properly as they should have. One thing that I didn't mention that presentation, but it's also the big mistake that was done in Brazil that I can share with you is that usually the alliances in Brazil were bilateral. The idea of an EPC contract was so heavily in their people's minds that they would have to put a project owner and an EPC contractor doing an alliance arrangement. And then the EPC contractor was responsible for dealing with all the key players. Can you understand that how obviously, I wouldn't say wrong because there's no right or wrong, but how obviously we are not still engaging the best practice here. So when I see people doing the project with some basic conditions for implementation of the project, I would say that I can answer for sure with data this question of culture. But for example, in our law firm, we are using lots of insights that we gathered on collaboration, and we can see how hard it is sometimes to implement. You remember when I told you about leadership? Even why leadership is key. I'd like to share a personal story here. There is one thing called discipline positives for you to educate your children. If you read a discipline positive, it has lots of insights of collaboration, of communication, because collaboration, at the end of the day, is more about treating people with the complexity that they have. And at some point, my at that time he was like a 6-year-old kid. My son wanted to go to do something in the weekend, different than what I had to do. I had a sailing class that I wanted to attend. And my son said, "Oh, this is not fair." Of course, he's a lawyer, son of a lawyer, so you can imagine how good he is even with 6 years. It's not fair that we are going to that sailing place that I don't want. I want to go to something else. And I decided that day that I would implement one of the ideas of the discipline positive, which is the meeting, the family meeting. Of course, you need as I said, a moderator, leader. I have 3 kids and my wife. At that point, we start to discuss how we are going to choose the family meetings in the weekends, the family activities. And my son Francisco said, "No, everyone has to agree." And then my daughter Cecilia said, "No, we're not going to agree. You think very different of me." So each one will choose one different situation. And I also have a very young one there who was only trying to listen to what was going on. But at that day, they ended up mixing up their solutions, and they said, "Okay, let's understand, because our 2 ideas they are both possible, but they cannot live together. But of course, it's better if everyone agree. But if I just let them talk. If do not everyone agree, and then we do sometimes each one choose for one time." It was very interesting because I said, "Okay, but what if I have an appointment? For example, so today I have sailing class." And they said, "No, appointments must be respected, but we bring them to the decision." I know it's silly, this kind of information, but there's one point that I want to mention to you, because my wife was not, at that point, my wife was not in the board. I mean, he was not convinced about the model. And then I realized that the idea of the leadership to be very engaged, even in family meetings, even because she said, "Oh, we cannot give them the decision." I wasn't giving anyone the decision, but the fact is, the leadership has a very important effect on this kind of project. So if you take someone with this kind of attitude, not only, what I'm trying to say is not about only culture, it's about the attitude that you have in the leadership. They can put people to work in a way that he values, and he even knows which which player has to offer in which situation, I would say that we most likely overcome these challenges. Going back to my family meeting, in the end of the day, we went sailing because Francisco said, no, let's go sailing. He didn't say a word. And he would probably be killing me if I would only try to say, no, I'm saying so, and you have to do because I told you so. It's an analogy that is silly, but sometimes shows a little bit. Felipe, about your second question, the first stage, I'm not sure if I understood your doubt there.
No, it was more to do, because from a cultural perspective, it's, desde un punto de vista cultural, en Brasil es común que, en Brasil, en Latinoamérica, es común que se invista poco tiempo en el planning, sí, culturalmente. Y el planning es muy importante para, ¿no? Como el stage one, o sea, se prepara, se elige bien las partes, se conocen las partes, etcétera, para la constitución del equipo y de la estructura de la alianza para que funcione. Y más en este sentido era parte de la misma pregunta, perdón.
Yeah, see, it's true. It's one thing that I mentioned there. And in Brazil, especially in public projects, you would probably have not even a basic designer or not even the smallest planning in the first stage. So again, I tell people that come to me seeking for advice on collaboration, if you're not willing to have a very powerful first stage of planning and aligning, and I wouldn't go for this path. Go back to where you were familiar.
Gracias, Leonardo. Eric, paso la palabra.
Leonardo, bueno, los temas que has dicho, que ha mencionado, como dijo Felipe, realmente dan para hablar días de días y bueno, son muchos, pero yo me quiero focalizar en un tema que es el contrato desde el punto de vista legal. Y esto es algo que, digamos, de la perspectiva de los abogados es interesante pensar al respecto, ¿no? A mí me gusta pensar en la colaboración como procesos, ¿no? Es algo que hemos conversado antes, y estos procesos hacen que haya un menú de procesos y obviamente en los mecanismos más avanzados casi todo el menú está siendo usado en un esquema IPD, Integrated Project Delivery, o en un esquema de alianza. Tienes casi todos los procesos en su plenitud, ¿no es cierto? Y la suma de los procesos es más que cada proceso individualmente, ¿no? Esto acá lleva también a que en procesos avanzados se genere una especie de organización virtual, ¿cierto? Esa es la idea para contrarrestar la fragmentación en la industria, ¿no? Ese es, digamos, el concepto general, ¿no? Y de ahí vienen, ¿no? Si estás en una alianza, lo que has comentado, riesgos compartidos. Pero, bueno, hay ciertos riesgos, y ahí viene la pregunta más fina, ¿no? Hay ciertos riesgos que sí son compartidos, pero hay otros que por la naturaleza de la relación contractual no deben ser compartidos, sino sí deben ser puestos en cabeza de alguien. Entonces, por más que, o sea, y ahí vienen los distintos grados, ¿no? Compartes algunos, pero no todos. En el tema de reclamos, por ejemplo, ¿no? Hay esta cláusula famosa que tú has mencionado, que se ve en algunos esquemas muy avanzados de integración, porque la idea es crear una organización virtual. Entonces, si es una organización virtual y no son varias organizaciones, no hay sentido que haya reclamos entre ellos. Sería coordinaciones entre la organización, o en todo caso reclamos dentro de una organización, pero que se resuelven dentro de la organización. No hay una contraparte, digamos, claramente en esos esquemas más integrados, ¿no? Esa cláusula donde no hay reclamos, salvo en caso de negligencia grave o dolo, se encuentra, por ejemplo, en el contrato de alianza NEC, o en los modelos de Australia, o en los IPD de Estados Unidos. Pero, por ejemplo, el FAC1 no tiene esa cláusula, ¿no? Tú mencionabas también que inclusive en un esquema muy integrado podría no hacer falta una cláusula de resolución de conflictos, lo cual también, digamos, a los abogados nos parece totalmente raro, ¿no? Y bueno, en cuanto a precios, Open Book, libro abierto, costos reembolsables. Pero ahí también viene la pregunta de si todo o de repente hay algunos alcances que no serían open book. Bueno, esto acá a lo que nos lleva es a cuál es el rol del contrato, ¿no? El contrato contiene los procesos colaborativos y le da una estructura a toda la alianza para que funcione. Pero la pregunta es si sirve como un contrato tradicional o si la función del contrato como asignación de riesgos y remedios contractuales en caso de incumplimiento es una función que se relaja. Y bueno, esto es algo que hemos conversado antes y además es justamente el tema de tu tesis y de tu libro. Así que quisiera preguntarte sobre el tema y sobre este tema encontré muy interesante la distinción que hace entre los mecanismos formales e informales de cumplimiento de los acuerdos y cómo recoges lo que, cómo el hecho de que el contrato establezca sanciones, ¿no? Buscando el cumplimiento de algo en el contrato, puede generar una consecuencia inversa en algún otro comportamiento, lo que llamaste crowding out. Y muy interesante también lo que has dicho varias veces en varios foros distintos, el contrato tradicional nos da una falsa idea de certeza, ¿no? Y pusiste el ejemplo de un EPC y dijiste cómo es, o sea, un EPC nos da una falsa idea de certeza porque en comparación con una alianza que nos puede parecer más incierta, pero que puede ser más efectiva al fin y al cabo. Entonces, bueno, la pregunta concretando lo que te quiero trasladar es este tema de cuál es la función del contrato en un esquema de alianza y si se relaja o no la función legal del contrato.
Eric, you know that this is the core question that I try to work on my PhD thesis, because when I realized what was alliance, I can share a story. I like to share stories. For example, the first alliance that I received as a lawyer to as a construction lawyer to comment was like in 2004, I guess, 5. And I already had encountered and had some familiarity with EPC and very strong contracts. And when I looked at contract, it would say something like that. The owner and the employer and the contractor will build an integrated team, and the integrated team will deliver the project. And when I read that, I said, okay, but it's wrong. How can I then enforce then my obligation against someone that I have a shared obligation? That was the first thing that gave me something to think. And at that time, I wasn't aware of the phenomenon. And I believe most people are not. Then I realized that the aspect of delivering the project is not supported by the sanction of the contract. The ability that you have to enforce an individual responsibility because someone made a mistake. I understood that in the reality. I understood that what holds the contract, that holds the relation, was not the contract as a punitive mechanism or even as a incentive for bonus or only economic mechanism. Based on this idea that the contract had not this traditional role that they have in a regular project, but if you think of APC contract, you put a lot of effort to describing the whole thing that has to be done by the contractor, that if they don't, they will be in trouble. and you get a bond for that to make sure that he's in trouble. And you wouldn't have that in an alliance. I remember that in this first project that I took, what I did was to reframe the contract saying, no, this is your obligation. I need to have that. Even though if you fail, I'm not going to sue you. I'm not going to go for you. I kind of ended up in the same idea, but I was so connected, so attached to what I knew, which was individual responsibility, that I reframed the contract in a way that it went to the same basic idea of risk allocation, but in a framework different. I didn't frame as a collective obligation. I frame as individual obligation that I cannot pursue unless you have willful misconduct. Because I had this idea of the traditional contract, punitive contract had to be the base for the relation, the success of the project. This is what is sold to us. What Alliance made is changing, and it's very strong. It's a different paradigm. It's different, saying that, okay, I don't need the contract for this core delivering the project. I don't need this. I just need the contract for exceptional situations. And then in my thesis, I would ask, okay, if this is so, if this is clear, why the hell are we for 4 to 6 months here negotiating this contract draft for hours and days? What's the role of the contract there, if not to pursue individual enforcement against someone that didn't deliver? And the answer was very interesting, because if you look at it, this is a more theoretical question, but if you look at economic theory of contract law, they already touched upon these things. What they do, if you look at some guy called Stuart Macaulay, they separated one thing that they say. It's not my idea of you, Eric, it's Stuart Macaulay, as you saw in my thesis. He separated the idea of informal mechanisms and formal mechanisms. So risk allocation, enforcement, it's all related to formal mechanisms. Even the governance, the formal governance. The informal mechanisms are trust, or management, things that quality of leadership, or sometimes even they say performance bond or something like that. But what Stuart Macaulay showed is that informal mechanisms, that's minor things, supposedly minor, such as the quality of the management of the projects or the design, for example, the quality of the design is much more important to the success of the relation than the ability that one part has to enforce a legal contract upon the other. When I saw the idea that Stuart Macaulay, and there was a major development after Stuart Macaulay, I found the answer for what I was asking. Because in the development of this theory of Stuart Macaulay, some theorists said that in this situation of high collaboration, that they call hybrids, the contract does not work anymore as a punitive tool, simple, but it works as a framework of governance. Much more like the society contract, the company contract. In Portuguese, you say contrato de sociedade. It's a plurilateral contract. It doesn't work anymore as something that is a bilateral thing that you have to use whatever is in the contract to punish the other. All this core aspect of delivering the product is sustained by the informal mechanisms. But you need the formal mechanisms of governance to give the support for the informal mechanisms such as communication and trust. You need sometimes, for example, if you look at project partnering, which is this idea of having a hard dollar contract or a traditional contract, but with a more flexible and collaborative management. The fact in this case, sometimes the formal arrangements are not very connected with the informal, but what I can see is the contract start working as almost as if you have a joint corporation or a joint venture. And the contract works very much as this framework of communication. This is a reality that changes a bit law, because law, and specifically contract law, which is my major of study, is very well drafted and designed to deal with bilateral contracts. Contract as a punitive arrangement. So there is a change in perspective when we think of this role that is performed by allies. Not sure if it's too theoretical, but I love this question because this question is a very tricky question and very powerful in terms of consequences, especially for law. Can you imagine law without, for example, obligation, without the definition of, in Portuguese we say sine lagma, that we have to fulfill your part for the other part, fulfill their part. Many of the concepts are useless in a context like Project Alliance.
Muchas gracias, Leonardo. De verdad, queda abierta una tremenda discusión que es muy, muy compleja y vemos cómo realmente el tema, la discusión de contratos colaborativos implica un cambio de paradigma y va mucho más allá de un simple proceso o simplemente que un contratista tenga que dar o las partes tengan que dar un aviso temprano, por ejemplo, ¿no? Esa es como que la punta del iceberg. Después hay un mundo más adelante. Bueno, el tiempo está corto, pero quisiera dar paso a una pregunta más que quiere plantear Mateo. Mateo, por favor, tu pregunta.
Sí, Leonardo, voy a tratar de ser breve. Como tú decías, el mundo offshore, el mundo del petróleo offshore, fue desarrollado en parte con contratos de alianza. Yo, como director general de una empresa que se dedicaba al offshore, participé en el contrato Britannia, que era un proyecto desarrollado por Chevron y Conoco. Fue un éxito y se gestionó bien. Actualmente Amazon en España está desarrollando centros de distribución y lo está gestionando con contratos modelo tipo llave en mano una parte, collaboration otra. Es una mezcla muy peculiar de Amazon. Pero cuando he visto tu presentación, que me ha encantado, me han entrado un par de dudas que con tu experiencia me gustaría ver si me la podía aclarar. Son dos dudas muy concretas. Los proyectos EPC bajo Silverbook también están muy bien controlados y al final se fastidian por la actitud de las partes, la gestión de las partes y no la redacción del contrato, que en teoría está perfectamente definido los riesgos y las responsabilidades. En tu experiencia en los contratos de colaboración o de alianza, ¿qué influye más, la redacción del contrato o la actitud de las partes, de los gestores? Esa es una pregunta. Y la segunda es que has hablado de Open Book. Yo me imagino que cuando hablo de Open Book no te refieres a los modelos de contrato que hay Open Book, muy desarrollados en el mundo del petróleo, donde se hace una oferta llave en mano o EPC en Open Book para asignar los riesgos durante la etapa de la valoración del Open Book, sino que te refieres a un Open Book de lo que es los datos puestos encima de la mesa, auditables, como tú bien dices, y donde el coste lo asume la colaboración. Sin embargo, ahí me entra una duda y es que supongo que en ese Open Book siga habiendo ciertos riesgos en la parte del contratista, como por ejemplo el coste horario, como por ejemplo los rendimientos de la gente, como por ejemplo, es decir, será un open book condicionado a dichos parámetros que parten dentro de la responsabilidad del contratista. Y esta es mi segunda pregunta.
Gracias, Mateo. Muchas gracias. Mucho gusto conocerte también. Mateo, I'll start with the second question. You kind of already answered what I think is what open book means in this situation. I also came across with a lot of open book EPC contracts that we just show a little bit more and say that this is open book. And of course, it's not what we see here. The idea here is to have a cost reimbursable, usually a cost reimbursable project. And the open book there is to be as much open as possible with the costs that you are incurring in this reimburse. You're totally agree. I totally correct. If there is some aspects that are important for example, you don't want to share your cost of manpower or things that are important to your business that your competition do not get access to that. As long as you can support, because the other party will understand, they are all in good faith. They have the same goal. That's the kind of thing that has to be aligned in the first stage of the alliance. You have to bring it up to the table, say, oh, I can go this, I cannot show you that. This number, I'll show you one number closed because I cannot risk the possibility of having this seen by my competition. Of course, that there is a limit for that. If you go too far in this speech, there is a chance that you bring distrust to the table. If you have to use the most honest approach for that, if you have reason to not deliver, not sharing some information, I think everybody should understand. This is something that is quite understandable. But if you do that too much, it's like a medicine. It becomes venom after some point. Mateo, I'm not sure if I quite understood your first question. Could you repeat that?
Sí, en los contratos normalmente, por ejemplo, un contrato FIDIC Silverbook, están muy bien asignados los riesgos y sin embargo todos terminan en arbitraje o en disputa. ¿Por qué? Porque los gestores abusan del poder y abusan de las actitudes, los gestores.
Sí.
Entonces, en un contrato de colaboración, ¿cuál es tu experiencia y cuánto influyen los gestores? Porque puede haber un contrato de colaboración perfectamente redactado, pero que los gestores lo contaminan igual que contaminan el FIDIC Silverbook.
Perfecto, Mateo. This was one of the mentions that I said, the quality. When I said quality of leadership, I was thinking about the managers, the people that are leading the project there, because they are the most, I would say the number one aspect that I would tell people to look into when starting the challenge of using this model, which is a model that people are not familiar. I would say this is the first thing, because I agree with you, Mateo. If you sign a contract or execute a contract of collaboration, but you have people managing in a way that they don't listen, they keep the idea of, well, I say so, you have to fulfill. It's going to go the same way as a EPC contract. If it's the case, I would say go back to the EPC contract, because probably at least there you have a punitive incentive, a way that you can enforce this kind of attitude. The worst thing that you can have is a hierarchical leader or manager in a project alliance, because you don't have the best of the collaboration and you don't have the best of the traditional contractor, which is to be able to enforce the contract against your contractor. So if you're not able choose a leadership that can collaborate, go to another model, because you probably have the worst scenario in both cases. I'm not sure if I...
Yes, yes. Gracias, Leonardo. Lo único que sí me gustaría saber, no digo hoy, sino que sería curioso tener la idea o conocer cuántos contratos de colaboración están en arbitraje o en disputa.
Yeah, there are some. It's a very interesting question, because in Brazil, I know at least two, because they came to me to discuss it. And possibly the two of them would be in arbitration the same way if it was a EPC contract. But in any case, there are some. But there is an information, Mateo, that is very interesting, which is about the Australian benchmarking on alliancing. I remember when I asked people like Jim Ross, which is one of the consultants there, that he said, oh, I've been involved like in 100 alliances here in Australia. And there was not even one arbitration regarding, or even one court procedure regarding alliances. So this is a strong message. This is a strong message. I cannot say that it's easy to interpret what he's saying, but definitely is something that we have to look into. There is some obvious things that we can do there. Obvious.
Gracias, Leonardo.
No, mucho gusto, gracias a mí. If you think of, for example, FAC1, what I like about FAC1, Eric and I have been involved with FAC1 in the translation. I translated with our colleagues from EBD, Alexandre Arueira, to the Portuguese. Eric, I know that Eric is translating to Spanish. And one thing that is interesting about FAC1, and that connects with what Eric was saying, is that FAC1 only puts a framework. Do you remember the role of the contract? It puts a framework of governance in a group of important contracts of a project. So as if you have atomized contracts behind or below, and you put a framework there, and people has to communicate and create a net of communication between these different contracts. It's a simple idea. They don't even ask for you to change the risk allocation. They just say, put some people to talk. It seems so simple, but it's not. It's not. It's simple, but it's not easy. It's like losing weight. I know that.
Excelente. Muchas gracias, Leonardo. Otra vez, muchas gracias a todos, los presentes, los participantes, a Mayo Educación con la coordinación y organización de este webinar. Y mi visión ha estado excelente y aprendí mucho con Leonardo. Muchas gracias, y con los demás participantes.
Perdona, Felipe, que te interrumpa, pero hay una persona que pide el nombre del libro de Leonardo, la referencia.
Ah, sí, esto Pamela, que le voy a pasar ahorita la palabra. Bueno, Leonardo puede contestar, de hecho. Pero hay otras preguntas ahí también, Mateo, que lo vamos a contestar por una cuestión de tiempo. Lo vamos a contestar por correo, ¿vale? Pero la pregunta está muy fácil, Leonardo, si puedes decir el nombre del libro.
Vale.
Oh, sí. Mucho, with a lot of pleasure. The book is called O Contrato de Alianza. It's edited by Editorial Medina, which is a Portuguese, it's from Portugal, an editor for legal books. O Contrato de Aliança. I can send it the details in the Q&A here.
Vale.
I was even talking to Eric that I'm intending to translate that to English and Spanish, because as David Mosley once mentioned to me, there might not be many PhD theses on this subject in the world. So maybe might be interest of some people there.
Sí, yo creo que sí, sin duda. Excelente. Bueno, buena iniciativa, suerte y suceso con éxitos con esta iniciativa también. Otra vez, muchas gracias. Nos pasamos un poco del tiempo, así que le paso la palabra a Pamela, que va a hacer el cierre. Entonces, muchas gracias. Un abrazo a todos.
Agradecemos a nuestros especialistas por esta excelente presentación, así como también a todos nuestros participantes por su tiempo y por formar parte de un nuevo webinar. Les recordamos que hasta el día 15 de octubre es la preventa del curso de especialización Contratos y entornos colaborativos en Latinoamérica y los cupos son limitados. Esta sesión, así como todos los webinars pasados, los podrán encontrar en nuestro canal de YouTube, Mayo Educación Ejecutiva, y como Mayo de Podcast en Spotify. No se olviden de seguirnos en nuestras redes sociales, donde estaremos dando a conocer más información sobre el sector construcción. A nombre de Mayo Educación Ejecutiva, Toledo Marchetti Advogados, CONEXIG y Legal Delta, les agradecemos su participación. Que tengan un buen día.
Muchas gracias a todos. Thank you very much. Count on me for everything you guys need, okay?
Okay.
Muchas gracias, Leonardo. Un gusto.
Gracias, un gusto.
Gracias. Bye bye. Thank you.